welcome everybody. Thank you for coming here and being part of our session about insight. So, what do you know about insight?
Is it a technical clean term, or can I just give my general word?
Just give your general, will be wonderful, thank you.
So it's kind of when I get a bit of a flash or a view into something.
A bit of a flash or a view into something. Anything else that anyone knows about insight?
It feels like grace.
Say that again?
It feels like grace. It feels as if it comes as a gift from somewhere else. It's surprising. You can't make it happen.
Fabulous.
Can't share what you're trying to do.
So it feels like grace, like it's coming from somewhere else. And what did you say at the end there? You can't make it happen. You can't make it happen. Anyone else know something about insight?
It's kind of unexpected. I mean, I notice it happening when you actually working with a client with these weird metaphors, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness,
What just happened? It's a surprise. Okay, so we're all kind of coming at this from the same angle. You look up the word insight in the dictionary, and there's a number of different meanings. Insight can be a capacity or a quality. But in this presentation, from uh-oh to aha, we're talking about creating the conditions for this thing called sudden insight. So insight, rather than a capacity or a quality, more as this single defining event when something seemingly comes out of the blue. And together we're going to explore that path to insight. And I believe there is a path to insight, and I personally believe that clean approaches, such as emergent knowledge, are fabulous ways to encourage the right conditions to insight. I'll share with you what I've learned from the world of cognitive psychology that I believe also supports why clean should help somebody reach a moment of insight. And I'm also going to invite all of you to work together and find out for yourselves, where does insight come from, and what happens just before insight? Not easy questions to answer, so we'll see where we go. I'm more comfortable sitting down, and it also means I can have a look at my notes along the way. So first of all, let me tell you what you were installed for. I hope you can see the slide reasonably well here. I'm here for a reason. I'm going to start by telling you what's motivated me to spend the last few weeks spending my spare time thinking about this subject, preparing materials to share with you today, what my reasons are. We're also going to spend just a little while exploring what you're here for, and seeing ultimately what you'd like to have happen in the session. We're then going to do some kind of definitions about clean, about where you are with clean, about insight. We've started to do that already. I think we all seem to have a pretty much clear idea of what we're talking about. And also emergent knowledge. If you're new to clean, you might not have even heard of emergent knowledge. If you have heard of emergent knowledge, you haven't necessarily experienced it or had an opportunity to practice using questions that are from that emergent knowledge area of David Grove's life. I'm going to explore, as I've already mentioned, what it is that psychologists tell us about insight, and what I find immensely satisfying and curious and exciting is they don't know very much. And I'm studying for a psychology degree. I'm in the equivalent of my last year, and this summer I will be doing my first proper psychological experiment. And I'm delighted to say that we can't choose our subject. Subjects are given to us, and lo and behold, one of my choices is insight. And I'm hoping that what will come out of that will be a more expansive piece of research where I can have an opportunity to show the academic world how clean questions influence somebody's ability to reach an insight moment. So that's where I'm going with all of this. We have a short time together. Every year I've presented at the conference, I've always run over time, sorry. And no doubt I will do so today. There is so much I would like to share with you, and so much I'd like to hear from you, that we will not have time to do it all. But what I hope I will do is plant enough interest in you that you will maintain contact and find out more about insight and about emergent knowledge afterwards. One thing that is floating around that I really want you to have a look at and read is the 12-page paper that I've prepared on the subject of insight. And that contains all the nice little sciencey bits that I've picked out and explored that I think is really interesting. And I'm going to try not to spend too much time going into all of that here today. So do look at that paper. There's a demonstration one only here. The bag. My lovely Miss, what's in the bag? Nothing. If you would like a copy of the paper, give me your email address. Don't tell me and trust me to remember, because I won't. Put a card or put your details down in there, and I'll send you a copy of the paper. I also had a migraine yesterday, which meant that I don't know really what's going to come out of it as what I decide to speak about. It's going to be a bit of potluck, which incidentally is how my partner suggested I prepare for this. I said, I have so many things, so much I want to say. And he said, well, you know, I said, so many words. He said, well, how many words do you think you need? I said, well, about 2,000. He said, well, take all the words and put them in a bag and then just pick out 2,000. I just thought that was a lovely idea. Just randomly say 2,000 words to you. Okay, so I'm kind of going off kilter already, because I think I'm kind of getting into what am I here for, what's driven me to be here. And I do have a real personal interest in how insight seems to come out of the blue. And that's generated by my own experience. I can remember, even I think before I came across Clean, was noticing how at periods of my life, or in a situation of learning, I would hit a brick wall of confusion. And someone many years ago said to me, it's okay to be confused, because confusion is the prerequisite to inspiration. Is that one you want? It's one I've heard, and maybe that's familiar to you. I don't know who originally said it, but it's quite a well-known quote. And it does seem to be that rather than move towards insight in this gradual step-by-step, things getting brighter and brighter and brighter until bam, it's almost the other way. It gets darker and darker and darker until suddenly the light goes on. And so that's kind of one thing that's driven me. I'm a coach and a coach supervisor, I'm a coach trainer, and I was very interested to read some research by Eric DeHaan, who did some stuff around, research around what are the critical moments, what do coachees value in a coaching session? Do they come away and say, oh, I really liked the questions that I was asked, or I really liked that they stuck to the structure of the Grow model, or I really liked it that they did this. No, they didn't even notice what the coach was doing. What they reported on was the most valuable thing out of the coaching session was moments of insight, moments of self-realisation. It's almost as though, was the coach there? Of course the coach was. The coach was doing A good coach would have been doing their best almost to be invisible so that the coachee was able to connect enough to get to that deep realization. A real key turning point for me, I didn't bring the book along because it weighs about as much as all the stuff I brought again. It is a huge book. It's by a chap called Stellan Olsson, and it's called Deep Learning, How the Mind Overrides Experience. He's a cognitive psychologist. It's a thick book, it's about this thick. You can download the first chapter off the internet for free, and I advise that you even just read the first chapter. It's like poetry. He begins by saying, what if the cognitive psychologists have got it wrong? What if the mind actually doesn't work like a computer at all? What if the mind is more like the weather? And he leads into the idea that the mind is a dynamic, unpredictable, ever-changing, self-sustaining system, which those of you involved in the clean world will kind of resonate with in terms of clean work. He goes through all the history of how psychologists have studied insight, what they know, what they don't know, and draws some really interesting conclusions that get quite technical. And he explains why it seems to be people get to this impasse, this brick wall, before they can break through. And I'll go on and explain more about that a little bit later. But that I found very exciting, and I kind of saw a strong link between clean and particularly emergent knowledge, so much so that I tracked down Stellan Olsson on LinkedIn. He only had 7 contacts. So I kind of said, would you like to make contact with me? You know, I'm over in the UK, I'm doing this thing called Clean. Lots of what you do resonates. You know, perhaps I can introduce you to a few people in the UK. And he replied and said, that's very audacious of you, and I'll bear it in mind. Well, of course, now I get to my psychology degree, the chapter on insight. Who's the man on insight? Mr. Olsson. So he's quite well known, and I didn't realise that. Yes, and finally, so all of this has culminated into me writing the paper, which I actually did a few months ago, and wanted to come along and share with some of the information around that today with you. So, and just one other thing about my journey with Clean, and this might resonate with some of you. I've been involved with Clean for a long time. I don't know how well you can see this. Back in the year 2001, 2002, studying NLP, had a personal problem, went to an NLP practitioner who decided to use Clean with me. I had no idea what it was before that moment, and I had the most amazing personal experience. From having that personal experience, it compelled me to want to know what it was all about, to really understand and learn about Clean, what it was, and then I wanted to practice it. I wanted to use and develop my skills and get expert at the use of clean language. And having done all that, the question that stayed with me was, okay, I know it works, I've seen it work over and over again, but why? Why is it that asking somebody these simple questions brings about such a dramatic change? And so that's when I wanted to start studying psychology. And I'd also just point out that I've kind of been around the circle again, because having spent 3 or 4 years learning clean language with Penny Tompkins and James Lawley, I then connected directly with David Grove and with Carol Wilson, hello Carol, and had a personal experience of this thing called emergent knowledge, which felt a bit different. I thought I knew where I was with clean, and emergent knowledge initially felt like clean language did to begin with, a little bit clunky, a little bit awkward. And I had to kind of go around this cycle a second time. I had to have a really amazing personal experience to convince me of the value before wanting to know what it was all about, and then how do I do it? And again, back to the same question, and for me, it's where I stick. I haven't quite answered that yet, and it's compelling me and bringing me here today. So, what are you here for? I've just had a think about that question, and maybe you'd like to write down what you would like to have happen in the session today. If you need more time to write something down, put your hand up. Okay, so could I see a show of hands? Who here today is pretty much brand new to clean? Okay, just a couple of you. And would one of you, someone who would like to, share what they would like to have happen from the session today?
Oh, well, I've just got I've got some insight into your understanding.
Insight, okay, cool. Sorry, did you put your hand up?
I hadn't, but I'm happy to share all this.
Okay.
To understand and to understand and be understood.
Okay, lovely, thank you. I've just kind of broke things down in other categories. Beginners, you know something, but not that much. Maybe someone who feels they're solid in the basics, but perhaps new to emergent knowledge. So put your hand up if you think you fit into one of those two categories. Okay, so probably the most of you. And would one other person who'd like to share what they would like to have happen say to the group?
I want to see what happens.
Okay,
That's it.
lovely. Thank you.
I was inspired by your title.
Okay, cool. And okay, an old hand. I could pick on a number of you. Would anyone like to, an old hand, like to volunteer what they would like from this session?
I would like to learn to enable the conditions for my clients to gain greater insight more often.
Fabulous, thank you. So not a great deal of discrepancy or difference across the different areas. So hopefully for those of you that have been around for a long time, you're going to get something new. Maybe not so much about clean, but from the psychological perspective. Those of you that are newer, I hope are going to get some simple techniques that you can take away and actually use. So I'm going to attempt to do something in all those four corners of the cold learning cycle. So personal experience, cover what it is, a little bit about how you do it, and also my personal interest, but why? Why does it work? Okay, so just stealing a little bit from Stellan Olsen and some of the other names that I've come across. What do psychologists know about insight? And you're kind of onto a sticky wicket straight away, because the one thing they do know is that it seems to come out of the blue. It seems to come from the unconscious or the non-conscious part of the mind. A lot of the experiments, and we're going to do some today, a lot of the experiments that the psychologists use present an insight puzzle to somebody. So a puzzle that needs not linear, logical, mathematical thinking. Who was in the maths session with Julie? It's a different kind of process. And so what they do is they show these kinds of insight puzzles that need a insightful, totally different reframing to come up with a solution, and they get them to muse out loud. In fact, I've discovered one of the experiments is they'll get them to muse out loud with no input. So just talk about what you see and keep talking and see if you come up with a solution. Or they do another experiment where they ask them questions. And they look at actually what's different between whether they're asked questions or just left to their own devices. So there's an area there that perhaps Clean could be part of an experiment like that. But even so, either way, it's very difficult to get to the nub of what happens at the moment of insight, and perhaps more importantly, what happens just before, because people don't know. Now, the neuroscientists are starting to get involved and starting to look at, well, what is it going on inside the brain? Can that throw any light on insight? And there's a guy called Mark Beeman who's done quite a lot of research. And I know there's a lot of understandable skepticism about neuroscience, because just because you know where it's happening in the brain, it doesn't actually mean you know what's going on. But you can infer certain things from looking at, through, fMRI scans, where is the brain most active, and what kind of pathway do the mental processes follow. And what Beeman discovered was there's this alpha wave, moments before insight. And an alpha wave is actually when the brain activity lessens and stills, and there's less going on, not more going on. And what he suggests is when the brain, or the mind, stops looking outside and just becomes very internalised, almost like my impression is like a meditative state. And again, I'm thinking about, well, clean helps you get to that kind of state. And then at the moment of insight, there's this gamma spike. There's this sudden moment of energy where new parts of the brain start to light up, and it infers that at that moment it's like the brain has made some brand new connections, and there's a new network that's given birth to a new idea. So that's some of what psychologists know in terms of the neuroscience. David Rock is a neuroscientist, and he studies coaches and looks at this subject of insight. There's a fabulous article that he wrote about the aha moment. You can download that off the internet. And he makes this wonderful analogy. We all know that the unconscious mind is bigger and more powerful than the conscious mind. And I can remember as a child thinking that, that meant the conscious mind was like this tiny little point here, and then the rest of it was unconscious. Of course, it's not like that. The conscious mind is an emergent quality that happens when enough parts of the brain are activated. Consciousness is an emergent property. It doesn't actually sit anywhere in the brain, as far as psychologists can work out. But what they do know, and what David Rock says, is a good analogy. The difference between your conscious mind and your unconscious mind is your conscious mind is just the equivalent of a handful of coins in your pocket, whereas your unconscious or your non-conscious mind, in comparison, is like the whole US economy. Can you get your brain around that difference in scale? To work out sums, you use your conscious mind. You have a white slate in front of you, and you play around with the digits, and you use your limited capacity working memory to play with pieces of information to reach an answer to the problem. Mathematical, there's a right answer. Insight problems are different. They require a different kind of answer. There isn't necessarily one kind of answer. And it takes a creative process. It means the mind has to go down paths that's not gone before. And there's another thing Stellan Olsson points out in his book, with what scientists, cognitive psychologists understand about how the mind works. It actually is quite puzzling how we ever get to an insight. Because we learn, everything is a building block approach. We learn and we construct our cognitive ideas based on all the things we perceive. And once we've created an understanding, everything else builds on that. So what is it that has to happen to knock down that understanding, to build something brand new? And that's when we have that moment of insight, like this lady was saying about. It's like a moment of grace. It feels like it's coming from outside of us because it's so alien to anything that we've thought before. Okay, so I've made the point already. Stellan Olsson makes the point that insight seems to mostly be preceded by an impasse, this kind of blank wall. And in emergent knowledge, David Grove talked about this as being the stage of the process when someone hits a wobble. How many of you have heard of David Grove's wobble? Okay, about half of you. So in emergent knowledge, questions are asked in a sequence to encourage a person to go through stages of insight. And David Grove recognised that around about the fourth stage was when people were likely to get confused and uncertain, and he called that the wobble. And that was like a prerequisite for reaching inspiration. Stella and Olson pointed out what seems to happen, or what psychologists knows happen, is when you think of a problem, the first thing you do is, almost as you perceive the problem, certain aspects of that problem are going to stand out as being relevant to you. And you will all know that in any moment of perception, you only pick up a tiny fraction of the information available. So in that moment, you will filter what you see as the problem according to prior experience. That's step one. The second step happens unconsciously. And you search your mind, and some key pieces of information that your unconscious has decided are relevant to this problem come to your working memory, like the coins in your pocket. So you basically scan the whole of US economy and choose a handful of coins of what might be relevant. And then from that limited selection of information, you attempt to solve a problem. So what's wrong with this model is prior experience. You know, Stella Olson, it's a quote on the handout that you've got. He says something like, in a turbulent world, you know, who's to say that the biases that we've laid down through our experience are going to help us choose in that moment, unconsciously, the right pile of coins to have in our pocket. But the problem is, once they're selected, they're difficult to let go of. And he talks about the soap bubble problem space. Psychologists talk about when we kind of consider a problem, we'll kind of put a boundary around it, like the coins in our pocket, everything that we think is relevant. And in order to be able to focus and think about that, we do bind it. And like a soap bubble, it's kind of held together by its own limits. And those of you that do know anything about David Grove's work, sounds remarkably like what he referred to as the small world space. So David Grove used this model. He said, you know, when you think about a problem, or when you think about a goal over at B, you automatically create the problem, which is you're over at A. You know, if you have a goal, you have a problem, which is I need to get to the goal. And in doing so, you kind of create this network of thinking, which is, I'm over here, but I want to be over there. And again, you bind that whole network of situations by everything you know about that problem, everything you know about what's stopping you getting from A to B. Emergent knowledge processes are all about trying to get someone to think outside of this soap bubble world and into new areas of thinking to get to the solution. Final point right down there, I don't know how well you can see, and I've already mentioned it, perception is heavily filtered, and perception is where this process starts. And I would also suggest that conception, you know, all our conceptual thinking, we're not born with the ability on day one to think abstract thinking. You know, we don't know about words like support and friendship and all these abstract words. It's only through our interaction with the world we build up perceptions and build our own understanding of abstract concepts. And psychologists such as Mandler suggest, well, any abstract concept is fundamentally based on a metaphor. You know, support is like what I felt when I was a child and my mother held me. Somewhere deep inside, I don't know whether that's got anything to do with what Wendy might have been saying with the core metaphors in the last session. So perception matters because it's going to be influencing our conception. So all this stuff going on in our mind, the ideas that we're generating, coming from that place of perception. Okay, so let's do some practical stuff now. Gestalt psychologists were the first to, oh yes, that's my picture of some neurons connecting into a network. And there's only so many parts of that puzzle that can be live at any one time. I liken it to a torch, so your conscious mind isn't in one particular place, but you can kind of switch your attention, think about different things, and those of you with an NLP background, you can only think about 7 plus or minus 2 things. You know, if you're asked to repeat a list of things, by the time you get to 10, you're going to start to lose some of them. You can only hold in that soap bubble world about 10 things maximum.
I just have this rolling around in my head.
Yeah.
The question about, is the mind different from the brain?
Okay. Another psychologist, Allport, suggests, again, okay, we do a lot of work in the cognitive psychology doing these computer programs to simulate the mind and how mental processing units work. And he says, well, what would it be like if the mind were actually a bit like the brain? Could it be that mental processing units have something in common with neurons? The point is, they can't actually bridge that gap here and now. But to my mind, with what I learn about how networking works in terms of mental thought processes, and what I learn about how networking works, and what they know about neuronal activity and neuronal networks, it seems very likely to me that there will be some synergy. It might not be a direct comparison, but there's got to be a link, to my mind. And why should there not be a link, more so with something biological like the brain, rather than like a computer, which is man-made and in, far less capacity, far more limited in capacity. So Gestalt psychologists used little pictures like this to show how perception is filtered. What can you see?
I'm playing sax in the little
Man playing a sax? Who can see a man playing the sax?
Yeah, so actually
And who can see the woman's face? Who can't see both of them? Okay, keep looking until you see the woman's face. If you've seen it before, I guess it's easier. Those of you that can see both, are you seeing both at the same time? If you really think about it, most people notice that there's a switch in attention. Switch between them pretty quickly, but when you see the man with the saxophone, you don't see the woman. When you see the woman, you don't see the man. There's something there about how when we select some information, we have no choice but to miss the rest. Can you all see both now? Does anyone need the woman pointing out to them?
I do.
You can't see the woman.
No, I can't see actually before.
There's an eye, a nose, and a mouth. Okay, you got it now? What do you see? I'll come to the back to see how well this works. I need my glasses now. Actually, it's easier without my glasses. Okay, so what can you see? Okay, someone said horses, someone else said a red Indian face.
Lots of faces.
Lots of faces. Count the faces. How many faces? Okay, half an eye on a time. The longer you look at it, the more faces you see. Psychologist Navon in the 70s recognised that we see the forest before we see the trees. Perception sees the whole, and the longer we look, the more we notice the detail. And what that tells me is about insight Conception is the same, or similar to perception. The more you think about something, the more the detail will start to come through. How often we just race on in our thinking, rather than just stop and let whatever's happening in the moment, to support everything that Nancy Klein said earlier. So Gestalt psychologists were particularly interested in how we group things together. Not just in how we perceive things, but how we construct our mental images, the law of similarity. So most people will look at that, and what do you see here?
Series of circles.
What people tend to do is see two rows, so that you see all the dots of the same colour as being a line, rather than just a random selection of dots. What do you see here? The law of proximity.
6 lines and you group it to 3 groups of 2.
Yeah, a lot of people will say at first glance they see 3 lines. Because the lines are together, they assume they're part of the same thing. So if it's near something, it's the same thing. If it looks like something, it's part of the same sequence. The law of continuity. What should your mind do with this one? You kind of fill in the gaps. And law of continuity means that you're unlikely to think that the lines go like that. You're more likely to think that they're crossing, because your mind will assume that it's going to carry on the same path that it's on already, that it's not going to change direction. And then this one, the law of closure, we'll just assume that it's a complete shape. Now, what's wrong with these? They're ways of perceiving things that help us to know things very quickly, but it can mean we're less likely to be creative, we're less likely to get to that moment of insight, because we'll think we've got a handle on what's happening. And I'll show you a really good example of this that tells you something about insight. You've probably all seen it before. Has anyone not seen the 9-dot problem? Please put your hand up. Yes! Now, if you've not seen it before, generally it's quite difficult. Once you've seen it, of course it's the easiest thing in the world.
Oh no, it takes ages.
So basically you need to join all the dots together by drawing 4 straight lines that are connected to each other. It helps if you have a go, but we probably haven't got very long for you to do that. Would anyone like to demonstrate? Come up to the flip chart and show us. Now I know, but I don't know if I can actually do it. Come on, give it a go. 4 lines connected without taking your pen off the...
Oh, in that case, now I can't.
Anyone else? Yes. Well done, thank you. And even when you know the answer, it's still hard, because what was happening with, you started that as your first line, the second line, what you needed to do was go past the boundary of the edge of the shape that the dots made. And that seems to be a problem, because what happens is we kind of naturally put a boundary around the shape, and we assume that we have to stay in that boundary. So sometimes getting to a moment of insight takes risk, going outside the box, outside the boundaries of what we think we know, and then back over there and again, keep going past to get to that. So that's what most of you knew. Let's see if we can come up with one that you don't know. Just summarise what we've covered so far. We constrain our thinking by constructing a concept of the problem based on what we know from prior experience, but very limited. We're not using everything we already know, we're just what the brain came up with in the first moment that we assumed was most relevant. Our conscious understanding is limited in capacity, and insight occurs when we can break free from these self-imposed boundaries. You've probably not seen this one before. Again, with the way the time's going, I'm not going to give you too much to think about this. So what we want you to do is show how you can divide this figure into 4 equal parts that are the same shape and size.
How many lines can you draw on it?
Any number you want.
Okay.
No limit. Somebody who's puzzling, let's have some thinking out loud. So who's having a go at thinking about this? I could ask some questions of what's happening for you. Anyone?
I'm wondering about the definition of the figure.
Okay.
So,
Definition of this figure.
yeah, so I'm thinking that if we fill that corner in, the bottom right-hand corner, then we can easily make 4. But does that count? Because is this figure the thing defined by the blue boundary or not?
Okay.
That wouldn't be divide, that would be add.
So is there anything else about the divide?
Neat. That would be a neat solution.
Anything else about this divide?
Well, you could take, if you divide it, you could actually move the lines. I guess.
It's not a trick question,
So just try and
but it is about what you're naturally going to do is try and make it a whole square, and it isn't.
Isn't it triangles? Do we not divide it?
I didn't get it, so I'm going to move on. So you can understand why it was difficult, and the solution when you see it is, oh yeah, okay. But it kind of goes against the grain of probably you were kind of getting close with triangles, but because you kind of want to make it a complete square, you think you must be kind of cutting it into squares. Doesn't fall. So what is it that needs to happen to allow ourselves to restructure our thinking in a different way? And we're going to start doing some stuff on that in a moment. I'm going to give you one more puzzle. You might want to have a think about it after the presentation. On the table here are 10 coins, all in a straight line. I'm going to give a prize for this one. Show how you can arrange 10 pennies, 10 10p pieces. You're not going to have time now. Come back to it. So that you have 5 rows, i.e. lines, 4 pennies in each row. First person to solve the puzzle and tell me, I will give you a free place on one of our upcoming courses, one of our introductory courses. If you can't make the dates, you can donate your free place to someone else, sell it to someone else, or do whatever you want. I won't give you the cash. Point that out now. But you know, there's a nice little puzzle. It's again, I tried it myself and I couldn't work it out. But it's quite interesting to kind of notice the process that your mind goes through to try and get to this edge of understanding, and you almost can kind of feel that barrier or edge that you need to step beyond. And again, I think David Grove's work really helped us to do that. We haven't got time to talk about Magis Eye. I did a little bit of research, can't share it with you. First developed by a neuroscientist to explore 3D perception. He proved that it's something that happens in the brain, not in the eyes. That's the little picture. That's the picture. Something about seeing beyond what's there. And again, I think there's clues to insight in that. So what has this all got to do with clean? I believe clean techniques encourage persistence, staying with the problem, the situation, long enough for something new to emerge, something that's already there, somewhere in the back of your mind, in your non-conscious mind, but up until now it's been kept outside of that soap bubble. Provides a method of exploring that is what is already known with a fresh perspective. I am now also learning with regards to insight and problem solving that coming up with solutions by exploring analogies, which is another word for a metaphor. The cognitive psychologists have been doing it for years. They just call it analogy. But it's basically the same kind of thing that we do with plea. It's not just the question, it's the slow delivery of the question. This became even more important when David Grove developed the emergent knowledge techniques. Pauses between the words are as important as the words themselves. And all of that just allows those previously unconscious ideas to emerge. Okay, I'm going to do an exercise. To make it fairly speedy, rather than give you lots of time to come up with your own thing, and to make it a bit of visual, because we've been talking about perception, I'm going to ask you to think of an outcome. You can do that right now. And then you're going to choose a picture. I'm going to show some pictures on the screen. Or you can choose one of these wonderful objects I've brought with me. Not one of the 10 coins, please. Or those that old hands are clean. If you want to use your own piece of paper or write your own words down, that's fine. I'm just trying to speed up the process a little bit. I'm going to ask you some questions to have you moving around, thinking about where you are in relation to the picture or object. Place yourself in that space. And I'm going to ask you some questions from David Grove's clean start process. Just help you to get the position right. How many of you have done clean start before? Okay, less than half of you, so it's worth doing. It's a pre kind of thing for the exercise. So I'm going to do that with all of you together, and then I'm going to get you to work in pairs or triads. If you like long time on exercises, work in pairs, because you'll have longer for each person. If you like to be the observer, and you're happy to go through this pretty pacey, and you can choose triads. These are the questions I will do with you all as a group to get your positioning right. And this is in the handout, these are the questions you're going to ask each other. 5 minutes of questioning. I think in my handout I said 3 minutes of feedback, and I think we're probably at 3 minutes of feedback now. So for your questioning bit, you're only going to ask 2 questions. If you've ever felt limited by clean language, see what happens when it's emergent knowledge. The more limited that the questioner is in their choice of questions, the more liberating, I believe, it is for the coachee, the person on the receiving end. So I'm going to finish with this question: what do you know now? And when you pick up in your pairs or triads, the questioner is also going to ask that question to kick off again. What do you know now? You might find even just asking the same question a few seconds later, the answer will be different. And then follow up with, is there anything else you know about that? And just repeat that question. It's an iterative process, so whatever the person says, you can follow up with, and is there anything else that you know about that? So each time you're asking your next question of the output of your previous question. That's an iterative process, and that's how the brain works in terms of creating feedback loops, which according to Stellan Olsen is what's required to get to this point of breakthrough. That's what I believe is the strong connection. The observer, if you have one, or the coach, the questioner, if you don't, just notice what's happening for that other person. Do they get to that moment where they say, ah, that's bizarre. Something's changed. And just notice what's happening. And then in the second bit, where you're giving feedback, ask some cleanish questions of the person that was being facilitated. So that might be the same person again. You know, when you said, oh, that's interesting, what was happening for you? And what happens just before whatever it is they say? And when that happens, how do you know it's happening? So those are the second set of questions you can play with. They're also clean. And then just conclude between you, what is it that you're getting from that that tells you about that magic moment of insight or the moment just before? Okay, do you want to pair up or triad up now? And then we'll do the exercise, or part of the exercise together, and then you know where you're going after that. I'm going to facilitate that together, and then you're going to get into your groups. And I think because of time, rather than it be a kind of hurdle to the end, I think you're just really going to have time to do it one way. I'm sorry, but I think that will mean we'll get a chance to do a debrief at the end. So you're just going to do it one way. So one person is going to be facilitated. You can all join in with the first bit, and then in your pairs or triads, one person is going to be the coachee, one person is going to be the coach, and then you'll either have a third person being an observer, or that will be the coach taking it to
We
the
can share
second
coaching to have two coaches.
Yeah, you can. Just stick to those questions. Really would like to see what happens if you just use these two questions. Okay, so together now, first of all, let's see what happens if we go through the clean start. So, all of you can do this. Think of an outcome and choose a picture or an object or represent your outcome in whatever way you would like. I thought pictures were interesting. Do we think of it now? Yeah, you can all join in with this. Just I think you'll get some of you might get an insight just from doing this first bit all together. I want my objects back, please. Don't take them home. Okay, and then once you've chosen your object, you can put it down somewhere or put it where it needs to be. And the pictures are where they need to be. And then where do you need to be in relation to that picture or object that represents your goal? And this is all about moving around, so just feel free to get up and move to wherever you need to. So this is all about perhaps helping you to reframe what might be happening in here. Okay. And is the distance right between you and your outcome? And do whatever you need to. And are you in the right space? And are you at the right height? And are you at the right angle? And are you facing the right direction? And are you in the right position? And what do you know now? Okay, just notice what you notice. And if you need to write anything down, then do so now. And then go into your groups and choose your coachee, who will then assume the position of the Gestit. And then you know you can start asking questions about what was happening. You haven't got a handout? Take a handout. Being about 30 seconds left, and I'm going to gong the gong. That means stay in your groups and now ask the second set of questions. So now you're being a researcher to understand what the moment of insight just before was all about for the coachee. If I had a moment of insight. Okay, just another 30 seconds for this stage of the exercise, and then we're going to reconvene. Okay, what needs to happen for insights? Did anyone have an insight? Hey! Good. Some insight moments can transform your life forevermore. Some might just be little moments of slight reframing that could lead to wonderful things. So, a moment of insight. What did you learn? What needs to happen for insight? Anyone have a...
Sorry. Okay.
I'll put my glasses on, I can see.
One of the things I learned was everything started to get murky, and I had an instinct to resist that, thinking, oh, I'm going to lose what was in sharp focus. But this time I just thought, oh, let's just see what happens. And that seemed to, there needed to be an allowing of the murkiness.
Okay, allowing of the murkiness. Were you looking at an object or looking at a picture?
I was almost intentionally not looking at it.
Okay.
When I did it.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Anyone else like to share?
So, I mean, related to that, letting go. Oh yeah, that was really interesting. Right, so I've enjoyed your stuff that you've been talking about so much. So there was an environment of uplifting or encouraging lots and lots of other stuff. And then the three of us, when we were trying to decide our roles, initially said, "Oh, I don't mind. And I thought, oh. And I wanted to be out in the middle of the room so that everyone could see me, so I was putting myself out there and being anti-fragile. And then suddenly, when we all came back here, we all just slotted into place. We all just said one after the other without assistance from the other one. Well, I'll do that, I'll do that. We all just slotted into place like these little tubes and stuff. So there was that. And it happened right there before I even was asked any questions.
That's slotting into place. And one more.
In our triad, I think an important thing was silence.
Yeah, that's true.
And that first exercise this morning with Nancy Klein was such a powerful demonstrator. And I think she suggested, and it's often crossed my mind, what would happen if there's a coach who sat there and said nothing. Nearly happened. If I had a migraine today, that's what you would have got. Yeah, so just some of the things where I'm going with the kind of things I'm picking out that I'm going to be looking for when I do some research. Something about time. And there seems to be something about that repetition of the question, what do you know now? And then what do you know now? It's marking time. And there seems to be something about you need time for some of this stuff to emerge. So
you mentioned Nancy Klein this morning, and we just had a little chat and came back just now, and I said that clean questions that continually ask, it actually gives you a frame. Because for me, I can go out there till the cows come home. I can sit and think like that, and I'll go like that, like that. But actually with clean, it contains it. So this is speaking personally. For me, total silence is not always helpful, but the clean questions being asked continually make me stay where I am and go deeper.
Yeah.
And I find that much more valuable.
David Rock concluded that it wasn't focusing on the problem per se. It was focusing on that kind of area. It was an indirect focusing, if that makes any kind of sense. He calls it mental mind wandering. And in his article, he talks about non-clean ways to encourage your coachee to have this experience. Let them go for a walk. Let them stay in quiet contemplation. Give them time to think. With clean, we can almost fast forward it. Repetition, revisiting what you think you already know. How many of you had the experience of saying something and then you're immediately asked the question again and you think, no, actually it's not quite that, it's changed into something else. You know, our thoughts never stay the same.
Angela, I wasn't sure that direction said only ask this one question, but in EK, do you sometimes repeat what the person has said and then ask the question, or do you simply ask the question?
You normally simply ask the question. You may, at more advanced levels of emergent knowledge, start building in a little bit of clean language, more in terms of wrapping their words into your question, but not so much as with clean language, where you begin by repeating back the words. And that's what I found incredibly difficult when I first started learning EK, was letting go of that mirroring back of the words.
So when you say wrapping some of the language, so you might say, and what do you know now about that tree? Is that what you mean? Just adding a little bit about what the focus is?
Possibly, yeah. If you were doing something where they were focusing on a drawing or something and they've noticed something about the boat, you might focus their attention onto the boat and say something like, and what does that boat know?
Oh, so you can do that.
You kind of do a bit of mental ventriloquism, have them put themselves into the position of an object, and what does, it's almost like that becomes a part of themselves slightly removed that knows something that they don't. That's one of the things that you can do. So it's often perhaps a single word. The questions are a little bit different to clean language. The importance of starting conditions, that clean start. If you haven't done it before, I hope you got the experience that actually it makes a difference how you position yourself in front of your goal and how quickly that goal does seem to become personified. You know, maybe some of you had that experience that it seemed as though that goal took on some kind of energy of its own. And that happens when you go through the clean start. It makes it kind of psychoactive. It joins in with the process. And I think that kind of links back to what Olson says about the importance of starting conditions in any self-sustaining dynamic system. The starting conditions change whatever else happens next. Gives the example, you put a ball on top of a mountain, you let it go down, it will go one place. Go up to the mountain again, you put the ball in exactly the same place, let it roll down the mountain, it will take a completely different route. That to me says something like the clean start helps you to get to a different place than you might have done without it. And just this idea of the reformation of the problem space, you know, that whole dynamic soap bubble or small world starts to shift. A couple of concluding slides. I know I'm out of time, you're going to kick me out of the room. Emergent knowledge, I want to talk a little bit about emergent knowledge. It's kind of cleaner than clean, it's stripped back even more so. When you repeat that words, you might get the nuance wrong, you might get the word wrong. No words at all, less chance of getting the repetition wrong. It utilises space, as you saw, iteration and feedback loops, repeating back the same thing or feeding back The answer that someone gives you then is what is the next question is asked of. It's involving networking, but you're networking what rather than who you know. I mentioned LinkedIn. You think about how LinkedIn works. Exponential growth as you reach a certain number of contacts. Same, I believe, is true of processing units in terms of stimulating parts of your brain that haven't been stimulated previously. It has a very solid structure. The repetition of the questions helps to create a safe space for someone to explore wherever they need to go. David Grove talked about 6 degrees of freedom, which again, if you link it, if you know anything about LinkedIn, it takes 6 steps to connect any part of a network to any other part. Again, David Grove felt that was the answer, if you like, to get to a multifaceted network of a new idea, if you like. We needed those 6 steps. And the 4th step was going to be the wobble, the part when you kind of started to disintegrate what you thought you knew for something else to emerge. And every step builds that network exponentially. I am about to conclude. You'll be very pleased to know. Next steps. If you want to learn more about this, we do distance learning training. We've got a course starting on the 21st of May. I have spaces left. I would love for some of you to join me. So much so that I'm giving you a really, really special offer. Some people here have done the course. They'll tell you it's good value anyway for 12 hours of interactive learning. I'll give you a one-to-one free if you book today. And then you get a personal experience of that. So if anyone's thinking about learning, now's the time to do it. Investigating insight with clean research. If you're interested in joining in with the research that I will be doing later in the year, let me know and I'll get in touch with you when I'm ready to start doing something proper with research. I want to do the summer project first and then I'll roll something out later in the year. I'll need people to get involved in it. So if you want to be involved, let me know after my summer project. And papers, if you want the insight paper, let me know. If you want the paper that I did last year, from inside to outside metaphors, there's that paper is floating around. If you have a look at that, you want to do that, let me know. And if you know the answer to the 10 coins, let me know and you get free space on the course. Thank you all very much.